I want to welcome everyone to another event in our speaker series. And I could say, no disrespect to any other speakers we've had, we've really been looking forward to today all year long. And welcoming, actually I should say welcoming back Leanne Simpson, because not that many people know, except those of us that have been around for a long time here in IGOV. That 12 years ago, Leanne used to teach in IGOV, and we're really happy to know her for that long and to be connected with her in our work, in our scholarship, in our friendship, and to have her agree to come back here is a real honor for us today. Those of you, everyone's here because they saw the poster, so I'm not going to tell you the basics of who she is, but I will tell you that Leanne is teaching a course on land-based and political resurgence at Trent University. She's doing her own activism, which she'll talk about today. She has a couple of books out which we use in our program, and I highly recommend them to anybody who's interested in resurgence and indigeneity and a true spirit of Native resurgence at the community level. She has 2 books coming out that are in publication, I think. One is a collection of stories, and another one is
a collection of stories.
A collection of stories. So 2 collections of stories that are coming out. And I really admire Leanne on a number of levels, but her productivity is amazing. For someone who has kids, who does the kind of political work she does, who does the land-based restoration stuff, and who's working so hard on recovering her culture and so forth, the ability to produce such high-quality academic work in such volume is amazing, and I applaud you for that. And enough said, straight from her star turn on the National last night, where we discussed, they actually cut out the most radical thing that she said. So maybe I'll let her talk about that later, but I'll give you Leanne Simpson.
Well, thank you for that fantastic introduction. Bonjour, Kinawaya, Giriga Vijuna Denawema, Kina Kachi Anishinabe Oguming Nadonjaba, Nagojawang, Megwedoda, Pitasmasak, Nadijinakaz, Nigichinendem Gibijayan, Nongam Ma, Andaek, Kinawa, Lakwangin Aki Minua Sanichaki, Chimigwech. I'm so very happy to be here in this wonderful land, at this wonderful university, in this wonderful room. It's a real honor to be back. As Dayagi said, I taught in the IGOV program 12 years ago, and it was one of my teaching highlights for sure. And I feel like when I'm looking in the audience, I kind of feel like I'm coming home, because in a lot of ways, the people that I admire, the writers, the teachers, the professors, the students that have a similar political outlook and do similar work are in this room right now. So I thank you all for coming. I gain my voice and my knowledge from being grounded in my homeland. And so I want to begin today by talking a little bit about where I come from. I am from the Mississauga part of the Anishinabe or Ojibwe Nation, and we call our nation Kinagachi Anishinabe Oguming, the place where we all live and work together. So our nationhood and our concept of nationhood is very much based on relationships. Mississauga Anishinabe territory is along the north shore of Lake Ontario in central Ontario. We call the lake Chinabish, which means big water. But Chinabish is also a spiritual being. And we have stories about Chinabish. And one of those old Mississauga stories is about this spirit, Chinabish, who traveled in a stone canoe across the lake to go and visit the Haudenosaunee and talk about things like governance and peace with them. And they have another story about that in their own culture, in their own oral tradition, as do the Huron, the Wendat. And so the lake is very, very important to us. Mississauga or Mississauga means at the mouths of the rivers, and the name comes from our history as a people who spent time at the mouths of the rivers that drained into Lake Ontario. We are the eastern doorway of the Anishinaabe Nation, and I hear we were known as incredible canoeists and fishers. Apparently, once we were out on the water, no one could catch us. Diplomatically, we had close ties to the Wendat. They asked to live in our territory at different times through history, and we made agreements with them so they could. There's a wampum belt that references this relationship. There's a lot of stories in our oral tradition that this relationship worked out quite well. They lived in their longhouses and farmed, and we were on the water and in the bush. We also have a long-standing diplomacy with the Haudenosaunee. There are at least 4 wampum belts that remind us of those responsibilities as well. And I think in times like these, in the midst of revolution, those pre-colonial understandings between nations and about political diplomacy are really, really important to remember. Mississauga and Anishinabe people were salmon people. And I know that sounds probably crazy, but we were. My elder, Doug Williams from Curve Lake, tells me that Lake Ontario had its own resident population of salmon that migrated through our territory up to Stony Lake to spawn. We drank from the lakes, and it was a good and healthy thing to do. There was also a large population of eel that migrated from the St. Lawrence through Lake Ontario up to Stony Lake each year as well. There was ancient old-growth forest of white pine that stretched from Curve Lake down to the shore of the lake that had virtually no understory except for a bed of pine needles. There were tallgrass prairies and black oak savannas where Peterborough stands today. The lakes were teeming with monoman, or wild rice. The land was dotted with sugar bushes, and the lakes were full of fish. It sounds idyllic because compared to now, it was idyllic. And our knowledge systems, our education systems, our political systems were designed to promote more life. Our way of living was designed to generate more life, and not just human life, but the life of all living things. Mississauga people were travelers. We rarely settled down. Stable governing structures emerged when necessary and dissolved when needed. Leaders were also recognized, not self-appointed, but recognized, and then disengaged when no longer needed. It was an emergent system. I think of our governance as a breathing, as a rhythm of contraction and release. There is a very high degree of self-determination in Mississauga Anishinabe society. Children were full citizens with the same rights and responsibilities as adults, but raised in that nest of unconditional love. Authoritarian power, that aggressive power that comes from coercion and hierarchy, wasn't a part of the fabric of Mississauga Anishinabe philosophy or governance, so it wasn't a part of our families. People were expected to figure out their gifts and their responsibilities through ceremony and reflection and self-actualization, and that process was really the most important governing process on an individual level, more important than the gender you were born into. In the context of fluid gender binaries and sexualities and relationships that were orientated outside of colonial conceptualizations, I see this idea of freedom as one that was woven into the fabric of pre-colonial Anishinaabe society. And so when Champlain came to visit us and refers to the women and the children as wild, uncontrollable savages, I think it's his racist white male way of acknowledging that freedom and authentic power. Now, over the past 200 years, without our permission and without our consent, we have been systemically removed and dispossessed of most of our territory. We have fought back as our homeland has been stolen and clear-cut and subdivided into cottages and sold to settlers from Europe and later cottages from Gitche, Keewagan. You might know that as Toronto. The last eels and salmon navigated our waters 100 years ago. We no longer have old-growth white pine forests in our territory. Our rice beds were nearly destroyed by the Trent Severn Waterway. All but one tiny piece of prairie in Alderville has been destroyed, and probably 90% of our sugar bushes are under non-native ownership. Our most sacred places have been made into provincial parks for tourists with concrete buildings over our teaching rocks. Our burial grounds have cottages on top of them. The veins of our mother have lift locks blocking them. The shores of nearly every one of our lakes has a cottage or as a home because the provincial government in the 1940s subdivided that waterfront land up and allowed promoted cottagers to buy it to make sort of a cottage industry close to Toronto. And Anishinaabe people weren't allowed to buy those lots. The rice beds are nearly destroyed because of the raised water levels from the Trent Severn Waterway, the boat traffic, and the sewage from the cottages. Like all Indigenous peoples, we live with the ongoing trauma of the Indian Act, residential schools, day schools, sanitariums, child welfare, and now an education system that refuses to acknowledge our culture, our knowledge, our histories, and our experiences. We also are one of the signatories to the Williams Treaty. And so we have fought against this gross and blatant injustice for 89 years because, according to our political traditions, it wasn't a treaty at all. It was a termination plan. The Williams Treaty is heralded as the first modern-day treaty, but it resulted in us losing hunting and fishing rights for 89 years. And so my grandmother grew up eating squirrel and groundhogs because if her parents were caught hunting deer or fishing, they were criminalized. And this past October, as a result of a civil suit, the province of Ontario sent us a letter that indicated they were now going to recognize that we did secure these kinds of rights in the 1818 treaty, which covers over 100,000 acres in southern Ontario. But imagine what 100,000 acres in southern Ontario looks like now. It's great that we have our rights back, but there's not a lot of places to hunt. Oh, there's Toronto, I guess. We will see. We have been living our understanding of our rights, and nearly every year since that treaty was signed, we have people getting charged by conservation officers for hunting and fishing out of season. Now, I know this story isn't much different than the stories that Indigenous nations here carry. But I can tell you, coming from a place where there has been tremendous loss of land, with experience and conviction that there is nothing more important to me than my relationship to the land. To me, it's the only fight. And so this is really the context for me for Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. It's coming from a place of tremendous loss, a place of tremendous love, and a strong desire to resist, renew, and regenerate. It's coming from a place where 200 years of entanglement with the Canadian political system has only resulted in the loss of our most precious relatives and the ability to feed ourselves. It comes from the moment that I recognized the thing that I could do with my life was to tune inward and focus my work on regenerating my language, my political system, my intellectual traditions, ceremony, and my connection to that land. When I was 25, I fell into this opportunity in Long Lake 58 First Nation in Northern Ontario that changed my life. I had the opportunity to be mentored by 30 elders for a couple of days every month for 2 years. One of them was the bus driver for the school, and so I used to drive up from Thunder Bay, and he would pick me up, and then we would go around the community and pick up all the elders, and then we would drive the school bus out to the elders' trap line. And one of the things those elders used to do with me is something that happens anytime you go out to the land with someone who knows what they're doing. And so imagine you're out in the bush, and maybe you're picking medicines, or maybe you're going to a fishing spot, and you're walking along with the elder. And every once in a while, the elder will get you to stop and look back. And then you'll move along the path a little more, and she'll say, stop, and you'll look back. And what they're doing is they're getting you to look at the visual clues on the landscape for the way home. Because if you're going down the path this way, you've got a different set of visual clues. So you need to stop, you need to focus, and you need to look at that landscape. And my ancestors were incredibly good at reading the landscape because it's what kept them alive. It's what kept them safe, it's what kept us independent, and it's what kept us literally connected to the landscape. So let's apply that technique to another landscape. Let's apply that technique of stopping and looking back and looking at the visual clues to the Canadian political landscape. Do I see Canada returning land? Do I see Canada respecting our jurisdiction, our sovereignty, our self-determination, our nationhood? Do I see them recognizing my responsibility to my homeland? Do I see a constitution and a federal policy that promotes that? Is Canada taking responsibility for the damage of colonialism and assisting us in the regeneration of our languages and our political and legal and education system? Is there any discussion about the rehabilitation of destroyed territory and environment? No, there's not. So I ask my fellow Anishinaabe, why do we continually appeal to them when there's not a shred of evidence over the past 400 years or over the past 2 years that the colonial state has the capacity at this point to build a new relationship? My ancestors' survival depended on their ability to read natural landscapes, and right now our survival depends on our ability to read the political landscape. My first mother, the land, is the teacher here. She teaches me to come at this from a place of strength and honor and dignity. Because if you go out into the bush from a place of weakness with tons of anxiety and tons of fear, you don't come home. So the land is teaching me to come at this from a place of strength, honor, dignity, in knowing every detail on how Anishinabe governance and politics works. In being grounded in who I am, and being intimately connected to every grain of sand in my territory. I will not beg because I am not a victim. I see this strength in a lot of the Nokomises or Kukums or grandmothers. In my community, whenever Nokomis Edna Manitowabi walks into the room, she walks into the room grounded, she is strong, she takes her space. She comes in from a place of strength, and she teaches us by the way she addresses us that she is sovereign. She's not looking for anyone to recognize that sovereignty. She's not asking for permission to be sovereign. She doesn't spend any time whatsoever negotiating. She just acts sovereign. And so I learned from her that the one thing I can do is to insert and assert my sovereignty as an Anishinaabe Kwe everywhere I go, in my body, in my mind, in my home, in my community, and I can connect myself to all of those pieces of territory, no matter what shape it's in. I can learn as much as I can about my songs, my stories, my ceremonies, my languages. I can work towards the flourishment of the Mississauga Anishinabe inside, and I don't need permission, recognition, reconciliations, rights, or funding to do that. I can rebuild my nation from the inside out. That's what those grandmothers show me. And along with that rebuilding, we also have to do a little interrogating. We have to do a little interrogating about how colonial society constructs race and gender and sexuality. Many of our nations have more than 2 genders. Many of our nations do not have that rigid gender binary. And if we don't do that in our nation building, we will replicate the heteropatriarchy that has already excluded and exiled too many of us. And if we're going to recognize women as the center of these movements in leadership roles and responsibilities, then we also must be prepared for the gendered sexual colonial violence that will be part of the backlash, and it will target our most vulnerable. This should not surprise us. Gendered colonial violence has been the cornerstone of colonialism. occupation, and dispossession. We have already seen this in the Idle No More movement. I have already seen my community paralyzed in response. We must have this dialogue. One of the things that Idle No More has done in my nation and in my community is that it has created a new interest in Anishinabe governance and Anishinabe politics, which is fantastic. And the last 6 weeks have shown me that we have a lot of internal work to do within my nation to teach our own about that, because I've heard too often in the past 6 weeks that Anishinaabe governance is lost, or that it's just the clan system or the seven grandfathers' teachings, or the other one I've heard is that the Indian Act chiefs are working to integrate it into their negotiations. In that 1818 treaty, there's documented historical evidence that the women told the chiefs not to sign. And they told the chiefs not to sign because they felt that we were going to end up losing more land. They felt that the crown wasn't being honorable. Those chiefs signed anyway. And the next 200 years proved that the women were right. And so many Anishinaabe scholars and historians like Tony Troyer have written that it was the men that were primarily, but not exclusively, engaged in international diplomacy, where the women were highly engaged in civil governance. And remember, Anishinaabe culture places a very high value on individual gifts and self-determination, more so than gender roles. So it was primarily men, but not exclusively men. Families often would travel to these gatherings to act as a group of people whose responsibilities were to not get emotionally caught up in the negotiations. They were a group of people that sat outside of the negotiations, grounded in everything meaningful to the nation. And when that group of people has equal power and influence and voice with the negotiators, our negotiators' resolve is strengthened. Not that we should be negotiating anything right now. But to me, the 1818 treaty negotiations are the beginning of a very vital part of the Anishinaabe political system breaking down. Because if that system had been intact, I don't think that treaty would have been signed. This is the start of women being removed from decision-making positions. And this is a trend that we still see today. Anytime women are included as advisors, but not decision makers. Anytime primarily male Indian Act chiefs are consolidating their power as decision makers and positioning the political responsibilities of women as advisors at their own discretion. That's not Anishinaabe governance. One of the very real intergenerational impacts of residential schools on Anishinaabe is on our system of governance. Governance and leadership and political traditions were taught to children from birth, through modeling, through storytelling, and through ceremony. And this is how I got interested in storytelling, because our traditional stories have a lot to do with our political traditions and our governance. And when you tell them to children and when you tell them to babies, they pick up a very literal meaning. When you tell those same stories to older kids and to youth, they start to pick up on the metaphor. When you tell them to little older people, young adults, they start to pick up on not just the literal meaning and the metaphorical meaning, but the conceptual meaning. When elders and grandparents carry those stories through their whole lives, they've got the literal meaning, the metaphorical meaning, the conceptual meaning, and they've got 6 or 7 decades of lived experience to carry those stories. So storytelling is a very, very important part of governance. And it's a very, very important part of governance. Look, I've offended him. He's leaving. I'm not going to make any Mohawk jokes. So storytelling is a very, very important part of our governance, and it's one that's really, really easy to recover. All we need to do is to tell our children those stories and keep telling them those stories and keep telling them those stories. So if we want to regenerate governance, we have to regenerate that component of our education systems within our families first. And so one of the places that started in my family and with my own children is with those creation stories. My Anishinaabe elders are always saying that it begins with the creation stories. If you know your creation story, you know yourself, because our creation stories tell of that creative process that went into dreaming this universe and then making this universe. Our creation stories are the story of that dream and of the creative and artistic energy that went into creating everything we know. One of the stories that I share in the book was written by Edna Manitowoc, and so I think the best way to hear creation stories is always orally and always from elders and always in the language. But I'm just going to sketch it out a little bit here so you can understand what I'm talking about. Joué Manado, that is our word for creator, but my elder, Doug Williams, translates that as the one who loves us unconditionally. So Joué Manado has dreamt the physical world through the first 6 fires. The first fire created the universe through the union of the first thought, so intellectual knowledge for all the theorists. The first thought combined with the first heartbeat. Heartbeat is heart knowledge, it's emotion, it's truth. In the second fire, Joué Manado created light and the 4 directions. In the third fire, the twinnings. The fourth fire was movement. By combining twinness and movement, Joué Manado encapsulated her thoughts into seeds. And the B'nai Shiach, the bird, spread those seeds over the earth. The sixth fire was the creation of the first woman as mother, the earth. And I should mention that Joué Manado in our language doesn't have a gender, so I move back between she and he. Joué Manado next created the first beings, but it took a very, very long time. She wanted to create the most beautiful beings possible. So Joué Manado dreamt. Joué Manado visioned. Joué Manado took time and tried things out. She was careful. He was persistent. And finally, after a good length of time, Joué Manado lowered the first being ever so gently to earth, Nishna, to be lowered. And that first being was the most beautiful thing Joué Manado had ever seen. And Joué Manado's heart swelled with love. Now, oftentimes when this story is written down, people write that the very first being that was lowered was this abstract original man. But that's not how our old people teach us to interpret it. Our old people teach us to insert ourselves in the story. So Joué Manado created the most beautiful, perfect person possible, and that most beautiful, perfect person was me, or you. I was created out of love. I am perfect and whole and complete, and I am good enough and deserving just the way I am. And when I tell this story to Anishinaabe children, it's breathtaking to see the look on their faces when you get to that part. When you get to the part where they realize that they're perfect the way they are, that they're good enough. And for just a second, it liberates them from that colonial mentality. It liberates them from all the people that have told them that they're not good enough. And you can see that light, that creative light dancing in their eyes. Our stories are a fantastic gift. The next part of the story I first heard in a workshop at an elders conference from Jim Dumont. And he told us that after Joué Manado lowered me to the earth, that Joué Manado put her right hand to my forehead, and she transferred all of Joué Manado's thoughts into me. All the thoughts from creating the entire universe. There were so many that the thoughts couldn't just stay in my head, that they spilled into every part of my being. They filled up my whole body. Zhwe Manado's knowledge was so immense from creating the world that it took my entire being to embody it. So this tells me that in order to access that knowledge from an Anishinaabe perspective, we have to engage all of our being, our entire bodies, our physical being, our emotional self, our spiritual energy, and our intellect. Our life ways, the way we're living, must reflect those components of our being and the integration of those components into a whole. We can't just sit around at our computers typing all day and expect to access this vast amount of beautiful creative knowledge. It also tells me that there is no limit on Anishinaabe intellect. There is no limit on Indigenous intellect. Within our collective bodies, we have all the knowledge that went into creating and recreating this world. We embody the solutions. We embody the way forward. When we're living aligned with our creation stories, we don't ask questions like, how do we get rid of the Indian Act? Because the answers are already there. We've accessed that knowledge from Zhwe Manado that's in our spirit and in our mind and in our bodies and in our emotion. When Zhwe Manado dreamt our world into existence, he demonstrated that creation, the process of creation, of visioning, of making, of doing, is the most powerful creative process in the universe. So my creation story tells me another world is possible, and it will be born of us. Resurgence is our original instruction. When we live our lives as we're supposed to be living, that act generates new pathways. Not very long ago, in my family, definitely my grandmother and my mom as well, were makers. We had a society of makers, not of consumers, but of producers, of makers. My mom could make everything but ballpoint pens and light bulbs and toilet paper. So we made everything. We made our homes, we made our tools, we made our songs, we made our dances, we made our ceremonies, our food, our transportation, everything. And when we had a society of makers, we were living in line with those creation stories. And we were all present. We had a society of presence because we were engaged spiritually, emotionally, physically, and mentally. So living with our creation stories is a very, very powerful way of living. Another creation story that's a pretty popular story in Anishinaabe society is a recreation story. And so things got unbalanced. There was a large flood. And where the story picks up is in this vast sea of water, Nanabush is on a log. All of the animals are on the log. Sort of like where we are right now with Idle No More. No one knows what's going to happen. We know we gotta recreate this world somehow, but all we have is water and a crowded log. So everyone's got an idea, and different animals start diving down to the bottom to try to get some earth to remake the world. And finally, Rashkon, the muskrat, tries, and she's gone forever. And sometimes she comes up dead, but that makes my kids really sad. So she comes up and she's barely alive. And she has a paw full of dirt. And Kinnock, turtle, volunteers his back, and that dirt is placed on the back. And then all of the animals collectively dance on the turtle's back, and they dance a new world into existence. Just like we've been doing. Now, the old people, my old person, she's not that old, maybe she wouldn't like me calling her old, Edna, let's call her Edna, teaches us that each one of us is that muskrat. Each one of us is Zashkon. And we have to dive down to the bottom and search for our paw full of dirt. And we can't all have the same paw full of dirt. You got to figure out what your paw full of dirt is. You got to work really hard. You got to dive really, really far down and hold your breath forever and then swim back up with your paw of dirt. We have that responsibility to pick up our handful of energy that is going to make this world better, and we have a responsibility to work together to dance that new world into existence. To me, awakening these traditions begins with individuals taking responsibility to live differently, to do things differently, and that can be a very difficult thing to do. It begins inside our bodies. It begins in our homes. It begins in our families. It begins with how we treat our children and our partners and how we make decisions as individuals and as families. It begins with how we behave under stress. It begins with how we model leadership as parents and aunties and uncles and as grandparents and elders. It begins with how we treat our children when they make mistakes. It begins when our women bring our new members, our new little citizens through that doorway into this world, into our families, and into our nation. It begins when our mothers bring those new little citizens up to their breasts and begin teaching them about sharing and nurturing and about kindness. When my first child was born, Edna told me that breastfeeding is how we teach our children about treaties. I had no idea what she meant. I was frazzled and sleep deprived also. But then, luckily, for the next 7 years, every 2 hours, I had the opportunity to breastfeed and to think about what that meant. And I think I know what she means now. Because for Anishinaabe people, governance isn't about being the boss. It's not about enforcing our opinions on others. It's not about power over. It's about knowing who you are and being responsible for those gifts you have been given. It's about being grounded in a nest of good relations. It's about being kind and gentle with our first mother, the earth. And it's about diversity, because there are a lot of really excellent ways of being Anishinaabe. And it's also about those 7 ancestor teachings, or 7 grandfather teachings. Most often when people talk about Anishinaabe governance, they talk about the clan system and they talk about those 7 grandfather teachings, which to me is only the tip of the iceberg. But when I was writing the book, I thought, I need to find out a little bit more about these, because I've only ever seen them written in English, and they've only ever been explained to me in English. So I asked a bunch of speakers, and I got a bunch of different answers. And then I went to my elder, Doug Williams from Curve Lake, and I gave him some tobacco, and I asked him to explain those teachings to me in the language or through the language, and in an old way. And so the first thing he said to me is that we don't call them the 7 grandfather teachings, Leanne. I don't know where you heard that. And I was like, well, I've heard it everywhere. It's on the internet. He said, we call those Kukam de Bajamawin in Curve Lake. Kukam, grandmother. They're the 7 grandmother teachings. And he told me that they're called Kukam de Bajamawin in our communities because it was the grandmothers that shared those stories with the children. And the way they did it was by telling a story about someone in the community that the child knew that embodied that characteristic in a special way. So it was a way of acknowledging a leader. It was a way of connecting that child through story to that person. And it was a way of teaching through experience and through storytelling. So we began with courage. And Doug gave me the word akadewin, the art of being brave. And he explained to me that this meant strong-hearted, not in a physical sense, but in relation to Debwewin, or truth. So he shared some stories with me and told me that Akadewin might be used to describe the weakest person physically, but that this kind of strength comes from knowing who one is. It's a grounding in self-knowledge. So Akadewin might describe the one that is given strength from family, or from story, or from teachings. And because of this self-knowledge, one that has Akadewin is without fear of the unknown. They're without anxiety. They're without fear or foe, because he or she is confident in who she is and where he is going. And of course, this confidence is exercised within the context of tremendous humility. Next, we moved on to Debwewin, the art of truth, or if you put an O in front of the Debwewin, you get Debwewin, which means the sound of the heart. So think for just a minute about how your life is transformed when you start to listen to the sound of your heart. How your life is transformed when you think of courage not in a superhero kind of way, but as one that gets their strength from being grounded in self-knowledge. So that's just a little glimpse of the powerful teachings of those Kukam Damajamawans. And it's an example of how important it is to go back to the elders and to learn these teachings in the language, or at least through the language if you're not fluent like me. I next asked Doug or Gidaga Megaze about the words for leadership. And remember when I was talking about working with those elders in Long Lake 58, they used a word for the conservation officer that was always harassing them. They called him Amik Gima, beaver boss. And so Gima or Ogima is a word that often means chief, and it's what we use in contemporary times. But Doug told me the word Eniganzig, which to him meant the one to go first, the first one to face the future, the first to face danger, the one that should be acting as protector. He explained this to me as the one that leads with reluctance. It's done out of a sense of responsibility and sacrifice rather than a desire for esteem or acolytes. It reminds me of that faster that's on day 30. And Iganzig is not an authoritarian style of leadership based on unilateral decision-making or coercion or hierarchy. It's a style of leadership based on humility, collective decision-making, sharing of the work, and sharing of the action. It's leadership based on listening, leading by following the people. And in my own urban community of Peterborough, we have all kinds of examples of Eniganzig. The woman that started Nichkiwendada, and all the ones that work hard to run it. Those ones at Ngojawin Friendship Center, the one who started the Bamadzawin School, the one who runs the Odemangizas Arts Festival every year. That medicine woman that runs our sweats and fasts and heals us when we're sick. That auntie that made us all those dictionaries and CDs and books so we didn't have any excuses not to learn Anishinabe Mawan. She's always patiently answering our questions on her BlackBerry, even from the grocery store. That one that dreamt our Nojem Theater into existence, and the one that protects Nojem and keeps us dancing. That one that brings those artists to keep our children's eyes sparkling. Those little ones that dance in the powwows with their jingles and their fancy shawls. That one that carries the little boy. The one that's the midwife, the one that knows about those teaching rocks, the one who writes songs. The ones that make movies, the actor, the playwright, the producer, the poet, and the little poet. All those storytellers. The one that looks after those Ninataguk, the maples. The one that blocked the road and stopped the uranium prospecting. The language teacher that walks around the lakes and takes care of Nokamistibigizis. That one that lets us build our lodges in the backyard. The one who is always clowning and keeping us laughing. The berry fasters, those Cree singers and dancers and writers that came to our community to share. those Haudenosaunee women who are our closest sisters, all the ones that give birth and care for that next generation. There's so much creative power in my community. We have a community of leaders. And I feel so very lucky to be a part of what's happening there. But so often in my community, so often in all of our communities, we don't recognize, we don't see the leadership of women. When we talk about leaders, we talk about chiefs and we talk about counselors. We don't see that diversity of leadership that women are working so hard day in and day out to keep our families and our communities alive and flourishing. In my community, I see leaders emerging when we need them and then passing on those responsibilities when another comes along. I see a lot of ceremony. I see a lot of collective decision-making and inclusion and supporting each other. I see a beautiful diversity of clans. I see a whole lot of gentleness, and I see an embodiment of Kukum de Bajamawan. And no one is called chief, and no one is called counselor. Everybody is just really, really busy doing. And what these Enigansings have taught me is that leadership is about relationship. At its core, it's about me taking care of myself and my family, about being grounded in balance and knowing who I am as Anishinaabe Kwe. It's about humility and responsibility. It's about starting with what we have and where our communities are. It's about truth-telling and naming. It's about telling our story and dreaming a different world, and then working towards bringing that vision into reality. And people say we can't rebuild Anishinaabe governance because the Indian Act system is all we have. Now, Peterborough is no different than other Indigenous urban communities in Vancouver or Prince George or here or on the reserve. There's a ton of dysfunction as well. I don't want to give you the impression that we've got everything figured out and you should all move. But it's crucial to see all the good work that's going on, because part of colonialism is to obfuscate that and to keep us in this place where we perpetually feel like we're drowning. Canada has a vested interest in disconnecting Indigenous youth from their lands, languages, elders, culture, and political tradition. When Indigenous people are disconnected from our lands, it is easier to exploit those lands. When Indigenous people do not know their history and political traditions, it is easier for the government to sell the idea that their solution is the only possible way out of the myriad of social problems they caused in the first place. When Indigenous people do not know their languages and traditions of leadership, it is much easier to control leaders by exerting pressure and political agendas on band councils, regional and national Aboriginal organizations. When Indigenous people do not know that we are strong, it is easier to continually position us as weak. Colonialism is always deliberate, and so resurgence must be deliberate as well. I've seen the people in my community awakened in the last 6 weeks. At our Idle No More events, we've had chiefs, we've had counselors, elders, grandmothers, families. We've seen people that I haven't seen out of their houses in years. People that I've never seen politically awake. It's been wonderful. It's been a wonderful time for visiting. But for this movement to remain meaningful to me, I need my fellow Anishinaabe to put as much energy into honest nation building. I was interviewed a few days ago by the National, and the interviewer asked me what I want. And it was an easy question to answer, but it got edited out. I want my land. I want my grandchildren to be able to live in our homeland unharassed as Mississauga Anishinabe. I want them to know their political traditions and their ceremonies and their language. I want them to know every grain of earth in our territory. I want them to govern themselves using our system of governance. I want them to flourish. And in order for that, they need to have a really intimate relationship with the land. Chimigwech. you.